I've always found solace in the stillness of the night. There's something about the quiet hours that lets you process life in ways you can't during the day. For over 40 years, I've been a welder by trade. My hands have built structures, repaired machines, and crafted things that'll stand the test of time. But when I come home, it's just me and my dog, Max. We live on a large farm out on Riverside Acres, just outside the quiet town of Windermere. The house, built years ago by my grandfather, is far too big for just one person. But after my wife, Emma, passed away, I couldn't bear to leave it. My kids moved out when they were old enough, and after Emma succumbed to cancer, it was just me and Max, left to carry on the tradition of tending to the land. One evening after a long day in the shop, I decided to take my usual walk. Riverside Acres has a sprawling property, and a single loop through it is enough to clear my head. The crisp evening air was refreshing, and Max trotted along beside me, tail wagging lazily. Sometimes I think he enjoys these walks more than I do. We've done this hundreds of times, but that night, as I turned the corner toward the house, something caught my eye. It was the second-story window, the one that looks out from the bedroom Emma and I shared. For just a moment, I thought I saw something move. I froze in my tracks, staring up at that window. It was impossible. No one should be in there. I hadn't been in that room since Emma passed. I couldn't bring myself to face it, but I was sure I saw something or someone move behind the curtains. The thought of a stranger breaking into my home filled me with rage. I wasn't going to stand for that. I rushed inside, heart pounding in my chest, and charged upstairs, convinced that someone had snuck in. The bedroom was just as I left it, untouched. There was no sign of anything out of place. The room looked exactly the same, silent and empty. I stood there for a while, feeling foolish. Perhaps I had just imagined it, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that room, something that didn't belong. The next night, I woke to Max growling, low and steady. He's not one to bark unless there's a reason. I sat up, listening intently, and that's when I heard it, a faint creaking sound from upstairs. It could have been the house settling, but my mind immediately went to footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the room right above mine. You can probably guess which room that was. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether I should grab my rifle from downstairs. I wasn't about to let some intruder take me by surprise, but after a moment's thought, I figured I'd handle it myself. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and slowly made my way upstairs. The room was exactly the same, no sign of anyone. But as I stood there, I felt a deep unease settle in my chest. Something was off. My nerves were on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next night, I descended the stairs to find the kitchen lights on. I know I turned them off before bed. I'm not one to leave lights on unnecessarily. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was in my house. Panic set in, and I called the local sheriff's office, explaining that I thought someone was sneaking around. They arrived, searched the house from top to bottom, but found nothing. They were polite, telling me to call again if I needed them, but their eyes told me they thought I was just imagining things. But I knew what I had heard and seen. The next night was when everything escalated. I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle in the night had me on edge. I decided to check the bedroom again. I don't know why. I just felt like something wasn't right. When I opened the door, I froze. Clothes were scattered all over the floor. Emma's clothes, the ones I had packed away after her passing, they were everywhere. I didn't understand it. How could this happen? And then I saw her, standing in the doorway, staring at me. I couldn't make out her face, but I knew she wasn't Emma. She was too short, too small. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart thudded in my chest. Without thinking, I charged at her. She turned and bolted down the stairs, disappearing into the night before I could catch up. By the time I got outside, she was gone. I searched the property with Max, but we found no trace of her. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. Every little noise had me on edge. I slept with my rifle next to the bed, waiting for the moment when I'd have to defend myself. I considered calling my brother to stay with me, but I was too proud to admit I needed help. I could handle this on my own. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. In the yard, her silhouette illuminated by the moonlight, watching me through the window. My heart stopped. This time, I wasn't going to wait. I grabbed my rifle, ran outside, and called for Max, who immediately sprang to my side. She was still there, just standing there, staring at me. I fired a few warning shots into the air, hoping to scare her off. She turned and fled into the darkness. I waited outside for hours, but she never came back. I haven't seen her since, but I know it's only a matter of time before she does. The unease never really left. I'm always on edge, waiting for her to return. I'm ready to defend myself, but I can't shake the feeling that this nightmare is far from over. At least I have Max by my side. I don't know what I'd do without him. I've always loved my job as a landscaper. It's not glamorous, but it gives me the freedom to spend a lot of time outdoors, and being out in nature helps clear my mind. My work involves driving from job to job, often late at night when the last rays of daylight are fading and the streets are quieter. It's a solitary job, but the peacefulness of the road has always been something I look forward to. One evening, I had just finished a late job trimming hedges for a wealthy family up in the hills of Harmony Springs, a beautiful neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It was around midnight when I finally packed up and started heading home. I was exhausted from a long day of hard work, but I was also feeling good. The cool night air and the low hum of my truck's engine made it all seem worth it. I decided to take the scenic route home, a winding back road that cuts through a small but stunning park, Harmony Springs Park, known for its peaceful walking trails and lush forests. It was always quiet there, even more so late at night. It was the kind of place where people go to clear their minds or take a leisurely evening walk. I used to visit it often as a kid, and though I hadn't been back in years, I always thought of it fondly. As I was cruising down the winding road, the headlights of my truck caught the glow of something in the distance. It wasn't unusual to see a few parked cars at the edge of the park during the day, but at this hour the parking lot was unusually empty. I pulled in anyway, thinking I could take a quick break. It was well lit, and the area surrounding it was peaceful, nothing like the city's hustle. But something caught my eye. In the farthest corner of the lot, a car was parked. It looked like an older model, a vintage Ford Mustang, with tinted windows. Oddly enough, it was backed into the corner, as if the driver had parked deliberately to avoid being seen. There were no other cars in the lot, no activity around. It struck me as odd, but then again, I figured it could be just another late-night visitor. I parked a little further away from the strange vehicle, turned off my engine, and stretched out my legs. The park was completely still, but something about the silence felt off. I tried to shake the unease that crept up on me and took out my phone. I thought I might call a friend to chat for a bit. Just as I was about to dial, I saw the faintest movement from the Mustang. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then the car door opened, slowly as though someone was taking great care not to make a sound. A figure stepped out of the car, tall with a long black coat and dark sunglasses, despite the moonlit night. The figure didn't move toward the trail or the park. Instead, they just stood there, staring ahead. I could barely make out the details, but the figure's presence felt strangely intimidating. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't alone after all. There were plenty of late-night joggers and walkers in the park during warmer months, and perhaps this person was just someone waiting for the trail to clear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few minutes, I decided I'd had enough and began to drive off. I needed to get home and sleep. But just as I shifted into gear, a second car pulled into the lot. It was a sleek black SUV, its engine purring softly as it parked beside the Mustang. This time I felt my heart race. The doors opened and 3 more figures emerged, all similarly dressed in dark clothing. They didn't speak to each other, just stood there, looking at the surrounding trees. I told myself they were just people out for a late-night walk, but the unease in my chest grew stronger. I decided it was time to leave, but before I could turn the truck around, I saw the figure from the Mustang start walking toward me. I froze. The figure didn't move toward the trails. No, they walked directly to my truck. My breath caught in my throat. "Everything okay?" The voice was low, gravelly, almost too casual. It sent a wave of unease over me. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, trying to avoid eye contact. Before I could drive off, the figure stepped closer to my window. "Do you want to join us?" they asked. "We're waiting for the rest of our crew. You could hang out." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Just as I was about to drive away, I noticed that one of the other figures from the SUV was coming toward me as well. This one was much taller, with dark hair falling over his eyes. He was staring right at me, and that's when I saw the faintest flash of something in his hand. It was a knife. My heart began pounding as the figure stepped closer, and I quickly shifted into drive, my foot slamming down on the pedal. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I reached a nearby 24-hour convenience store. I called my best friend, told him everything, and he immediately met me there. I could still feel my heart racing, my hands shaking as I gripped the phone. When we went back to the park the next morning to report the incident to the authorities, there was no sign of anyone. No strange cars, no parked vehicles, not a trace of the people I had seen. The security footage from the park's cameras was corrupted, making it impossible to track anything. I'm still not sure what happened that night or who those people were, but I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to leave that park in one piece. I haven't gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. I don't remember all the details as clearly as I once did. It was years ago after all, but the chilling memories of that night have never left me. I grew up in a small town just outside of Wilmington, Delaware. It's the kind of place where not much ever seems to happen, and boredom was often our biggest enemy. My friends and I, like many teenagers at the time, found our thrills in strange places. Abandoned buildings, dark alleys, and crumbling structures long forgotten by time. There was one place in particular that we always gravitated toward, an old abandoned estate just off Old Baltimore Pike. It was called Rosewood Manor, and the first time I saw it, I knew it would become our secret haunt. The manor was at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, surrounded by trees whose branches tangled like fingers in the air. It had been empty for years, and though its grandeur was fading, you could still feel the weight of its history. The address was easy to remember, 220 Rosewood Drive. It was always quiet there, save for the rustling of the wind through the trees or the occasional sound of animals scurrying around in the underbrush. The first time we ventured inside, we had to crawl through a broken window. The door had long since been nailed shut, and the windows had been boarded up, save for this one in the back. Once inside, the first thing you noticed was the silence, thick and oppressive. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, the remnants of forgotten years. The wallpaper was peeling, and the once beautiful chandeliers now hung crookedly from the ceiling like remnants of a past life. We were there one crisp autumn evening, with the air carrying that sharp bite of chill that marks the beginning of the season. There were 5 of us that night: me, Sarah, James, Lily, and Mark. The plan was simple: sneak inside, drink a little, and dare each other to explore the deeper parts of the house. We'd done it before in other places, so we thought nothing of it. Rosewood Manor had 3 floors. The first floor was mostly open space, the remnants of what must have been a grand hall. The second floor had the bedrooms. Most were empty, but the dust was thick, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The third floor, the attic, was always the most frightening. We'd been up there a few times, but it always felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. That night, we decided to start in the basement. The stairs were steep, covered in cobwebs, and it felt as though they hadn't been touched in decades. The basement itself was a maze of rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. The first room we came across was relatively harmless, or so we thought. It was a storage space filled with old furniture, broken tables, chairs covered in dust, and a couple of wooden cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened since the early 1900s. There was a faint smell, like mildew and old wood, but nothing too alarming. That is, until we heard it. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from upstairs. At first, we thought it was the wind, or maybe one of us had made a noise without realizing it. But the footsteps came again, closer this time, and then the sound of a door creaking open. Sarah's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, but no one had to say anything. We all heard it. Mark, being the brave one of the group, decided to investigate. We followed him up the stairs trying to keep quiet, but the creaks of the old wood made it impossible. We reached the second floor, and that's when we saw it. The door at the far end of the hall was wide open. The room beyond was dark, but we could make out the shapes of old furniture, chairs, a broken lamp, and a large, full-length mirror. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and we shivered as we stepped inside. It was then that I saw the first strange thing. The mirror. It was cracked, but that wasn't what stood out. It was the reflection. In the mirror, I saw a woman in a wedding dress. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and black, like she hadn't blinked in years. She stood still, staring at us, as though waiting for something. I backed away in fear, but as I turned to leave, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut behind us. We ran, all of us, without hesitation, sprinting down the stairs and out of the house. We scrambled through the window we'd entered, not once looking back. As we stood on the driveway, panting and terrified, we looked up. In the window of the second floor, I saw her again. The woman in the wedding dress. She stood there, her silhouette framed against the dim light of the moon. We never returned to Rosewood Manor, not once. The house was demolished years later, and no one ever really talked about what happened that night. But I'll never forget the feeling of those cold, lifeless eyes following me out the door. And I'm not sure I'll ever truly understand what we encountered there. If anyone ever dares to look up Rosewood Manor, you won't find much. Just an address and a lot of history, but no mention of what happened inside. Maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left forgotten.